In this second part of a two-part series on logic and fallacies, we'll take a look at the many classic fallacies out there, why they're logically unsound, and how some people attempt to use them in bad arguments made against Satanism. A lot to learn here on Satansplain.
Well, it's not Satan worship, it's Satanism. It's embracing the life-enriching things which have traditionally been given the devil's name. Pride, lust, earthly success, rational self-interest, atheism, humor, nonconformity, science, a passion for living, being selective about whom we love. We don't see these as shameful sins, but empowering ideals. And we also recognize the psychological power and fun of symbolism and aesthetics, so we utilize Satan as mythology's most fitting mascot for what we're about.
Satansplain, Satanic Talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M.
Welcome to Satansplain. As mentioned in the introduction, this is part 2 of a two-part special series of episodes on the topic of logic and fallacies. If you have not heard part 1 yet, I suggest you listen to that one first before proceeding with this episode. Otherwise, if you're still listening, I'm going to assume you did listen to part 1, so let's continue. In part 1, I talked about logic, what it is, what it isn't. I explained inductive logic versus deductive logic. And at the end of part 1, we started to get into the topic of fallacies. Fallacies are examples of arguments that may seem logical or even persuasive, but are not in fact logically sound. And it was near the end of that part 1 episode that I started giving some examples of fallacies. As I said, this part 2 episode will be a continuation of that. I'll be spending this episode giving examples of different logical fallacies and some of the ways people try to use them against Satanism or in arguments leveled against atheists in general, really. As with part 1, you'll find chapter breaks in the description of the episode, at least on YouTube. I won't cover every formally named type of fallacy in existence, but I've got a lot I'm going to throw at you, so those chapter breaks are there if you need to skip back and forth. At the end of part 1, we talked about fallacies like the straw man, the black and white fallacy, the argument from ignorance, shifting the burden of proof, and a few other fallacies that may be related to one or more of those. So let's continue now with another popular fallacy, and that is the fallacy known as the No True Scotsman fallacy. What is the No True Scotsman fallacy? Well, let's say you're hanging out with this angry guy who tells you no Scotsman would ever put sugar in his porridge. And you say, well, I have a Scotsman friend, Angus, he's a Scotsman, and he puts sugar in his porridge. And the angry guy says, but you see, lad, a true Scotsman would never do that. So this is a fallacy because what defines a Scotsman is somebody who is from Scotland, or perhaps you could extend that to people of just Scottish ethnicity, Scottish descent. Regardless, being Scottish has nothing to do with the use of food sweeteners. But as Satanists, we sometimes get forms of this fallacy thrown at us. You may see a conspiracy theorist saying, well, Satanists kidnap babies and drink goat's blood and sign pacts in blood and blah, 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 at which point you might say, no, Satanists don't do any of that stuff. Go read the Satanic Bible. And you may hear back, no, I'm talking about real Satanists, true Satanists, like serial killer Richard Ramirez. Because you guys, you Church of Satan people, you're just a front for the real thing, the real Satanism. Again, fallacious thinking. Now, speaking of this fallacy, the No True Scotsman fallacy, it is worth mentioning that this is a fallacy we Satanists ourselves get accused of using sometimes. I've talked about this on the show before. There will be a news story about a devil worshiper murdering somebody, or one of these idiots from Kevin Solling's political stunt group doing something in the name of Satanism, or some other idiots similarly doing stupid things with satanic trappings. And the media will describe this person as a Satanist, and we say, no, that's not Satanism, and these people are not Satanists. And then, quite often, some smug pseudo-intellectual asshole will say, Oh, that's a No True Scotsman fallacy. You're using the definition of Satanism to mean only you. It's just like when Catholics say that Protestants aren't real Christians or vice versa. You're doing the same thing when you say these other people cannot be Satanists. To which I say, you're wrong, because as I have explained numerous times before, and it's worth explaining here again, we have a pretty definitive idea on what Satanism is. We, the Church of Satan, established it. There is no evidence, none, of an actual developed religion calling itself Satanism and its practitioners calling themselves Satanists before us. So we've got dibs on the term. Throwing the same label of Satanism onto some belief system that we have little or even nothing in common with does not make that a new denomination of Satanism. That's not how religion denominations work. I know that to non-Satanists, these people in the news may all look like different denominations of the same religion, having a bunch of infighting, sect rivalry, or whatever you want to call it, with each other. But honestly, that's not what is going on here. Protestants and Catholics are indeed denominations of the same religion. They are both denominations of Christianity. That's because despite their differences, they actually have a common foundation, common theology, common origins, and the common traits which distinguish Christianity from non-Christianity. They may have different views on faith versus works, or, of tradition versus individual study, or the interpretation of this particular verse from the Bible, but at the end of the day, they essentially share the same holy book, the Bible, the same view of deity and the Trinity, and ultimately focus on the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus as described in the Gospels and so on. And you cannot say the same sort of thing about our religion, Satanism, and some idiot who hears voices in his head, so he copies things out of a Jack Chick tract. Or people who throw a pentagram over social justice warrior crap and call it Satanism. Again, the denominations of different religions doesn't work like that. These are not people practicing the same religion as us. They are not taking the same religion at a different angle. It's not like they have the Satanic Bible and have a different interpretation of this or that. No, they are throwing everything but the jewelry away and practicing some other fundamentally different belief system. So in summary, calling out pseudo-Satanists is not a No True Scotsman fallacy. It's more like the Scottish Embassy trying to explain why a man wrapped up in an entire roll of Scotch tape is not necessarily a Scotsman. I'm sorry if you're sick of hearing me bring this example up, and I know this episode is supposed to be about logical fallacies, but I figured as long as we were talking about the No True Scotsman fallacy, I would take a minute to debunk this really stupid argument that I keep hearing over and over. Now, let's move on. Another wordplay fallacy, if you will, that's similar to the No True Scotsman fallacy is the Equivocation fallacy, and that is when you use the same word to mean two different things in the same argument. The joke I told in part 1 about love, God, and Ray Charles, I would say is an example of this, the Equivocation fallacy. But here's another favorite example. Let's say somebody says, stale bread is better than nothing. Nothing is better than a deliciously cooked steak. Therefore, it follows that stale bread is better than steak. Well, I would argue that the conclusion is false. I would not say stale bread is better than steak. So, where is the fallacy? I mean, it sounds like it follows, right? A is B, B is C, therefore A is C. And the premise is, even if you personally don't like steak, if we're going to go along with the assumptions in the premises, it doesn't seem like the notion of bread being better than steak is consistent with saying nothing is better than steak, so where is the flaw? Well, the problem here is that I use the word nothing in two grammatically different ways. Stale bread is better than nothing, nothing is better than steak. So remember I said in part 1 that there are often multiple ways to reword the same premise. So when I say stale bread is better than nothing, another way to restate that same premise is having stale bread to eat is better than having no food at all. Likewise, when I say nothing is better than steak, what I'm really claiming here is steak is the best food, or eating steak is the most enjoyable thing in the world. Those are equivalent ways of rewording the same premise. So when you put these reworded versions together, you now get the following. Having stale bread is better than having no food. Steak is the best food. Therefore, stale bread is better than steak. Well, that conclusion doesn't follow at all from the premises. So again, it's all because of the equivocation fallacy, using the word nothing to mean two different things in two different contexts. So hopefully you see the flow of that now. Now, an example of the equivocation fallacy used against Satanism, I would say, is watching Christians use the term satanic to refer to anything they don't like, and then trying to rope the real Satanists, into the list of complaints by association. In any case, you've got to be careful with your words and watch how your opponent is using certain words. In fact, here's a tip. If you find yourself stuck in a debate that seems to go in circles over and over again, you may want to check that you and your opponent have the same understanding of key words in that debate. I mean, take, for example, people who try to condemn Satanists with the accusation of, you guys believe in magic. And, of course, their definition of magic they're using in their argument, in their head, does not match the one we use. The definition found in the Satanic Bible, which doesn't require, for example, belief in the supernatural. So you could also call this example a form of the straw man argument as well, for that matter, but, equivocation fallacy, still the same idea. In fact, as you'll see in some of these other examples, some bad arguments might be a combination of two or more different types of fallacies, or can be called one of two different or more types. Another fallacy is called moving the goalposts, and this happens when somebody makes an argument and then loses the argument, but instead of admitting defeat, they'll say, well, I didn't really lose the argument because when I said this earlier, what I was really referring to was this other thing. Or they may say, okay, you may have proved that, but what about this other thing? I bet you don't have an answer to this, so I'm still right. Now, there's an idiot on YouTube, for example, who made a clip titled, Was Anton LaVey an LGBT ally? So, in essence, it's saying, yeah, Anton LaVey was a homophobe and a transphobe, and oh, wait, he wasn't? You can point to lines in the Satanic Bible where it says that stuff is explicitly allowed. Well, fine, he wasn't a homophobe, but he wasn't an LGBT ally, I bet. So that makes him homophobic. To which I say, no, fuck you, and fuck your demands for everybody to be an activist. Now, it's one thing if maybe you have to clarify something. Maybe you weren't as clear as you could have been at the beginning of your argument, in which case there's no shame in saying, okay, sorry, I guess I should have worded my argument differently, or I'm sorry, I should have clarified what I meant by this term. I just assumed you meant that, and I was wrong to assume that, so here's what I mean. So if that happens, at least have the intellectual honesty to be more clear. Now, using another creationist example, I was using some of those in the last episode, I've gotten into debates with creationists who will rhetorically ask, well, if evolution is true, then how does it explain this? And then I'll say, okay, here you go. Here's 3 articles, 2 books, plus a 3-paragraph summary in layman's terms from myself, explaining how evolution explains this thing you asked about. Then, instead of acknowledging this, they'll just completely ignore what I just said and say, all right, well then, how do those things come from evolution if, that thing did? You can't explain that. And again, moving the goalposts, people like this are just intellectual black holes who think that if they get the last word in, somehow they've won. Evolution couldn't answer the 80th question I asked, so I win. No, you've ignored the 79 times before that. People did answer the questions you had, and you had no rebuttal. In fact, there is a similar phenomenon called the Gish Gallop, and it's named after Duane Gish. Duane Gish was a creationist, and one thing he used to do in debates was rattle off a lot of claims in a short time, such that it was impossible for his opponents to explain each and everything he said and why it's wrong, let alone, explain it all in layman's terms and in a reasonable amount of time. So beware of the Gish Gallop. And the topic could be anything, really. It could be a conspiracy theorist who makes 20 replies in a row of just YouTube clips of conspiracy theory videos, for example. And then if you don't answer and refute all 20 of them, somehow he's the winner. So yeah, the Gish Gallop. This reminds me of an LHA. That's a lunar hoax advocate, somebody who believes, that the Apollo moon landing was a hoax. And I just have to share this story while I'm thinking of it. I was on the now-defunct science forums on Amazon.com. There was a crazy lady there who was using one argument after another trying to prove that the moon landing was fake, that it was secretly staged and recorded in a film studio, and so on. And the other people in that forum were actual scientists. And every time she copied and pasted, some conspiracy theory she found on the web, the scientists there would debunk it. So she would say, in this film footage, we see fire from the engine, and this wouldn't happen because of no oxygen on the moon. And the scientists would say, no, we would expect to see that in rockets because the rockets contain this and blah, 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 blah. They were responding to this lady with actual science. Of course, like every time, instead of acknowledging that she was wrong, she just acted like she didn't lose the argument at all, pretended that she didn't hear anything, and just went right on with the next claim. Another copy-paste claim, and another one, and another one. And this thread went on for weeks, maybe months. And eventually the scientists were saying, no, you already used that argument last week. Click back to page 16 in the thread. We already addressed that. So she's getting more and more desperate every day. By the way, one of the underlying phenomena here is what's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is when crazy people somehow think they know more than a topic, than an actual expert in the field. It's true that being an authority on a topic doesn't automatically make you right. That's another fallacy we'll talk about later in this episode. Argument from authority. But the opposite extreme is when people get it into their heads that this is all a case of the emperor's new clothes and that they, the oh-so-humble, uneducated person, can see something that all of the expert PhDs have somehow missed. So it's ridiculous, but that's what was going on here. And as she lost more and more arguments, the stranger and stranger her new arguments were getting, until it reached the point where she was clearly just Googling some related words and copying and pasting whatever links came up without even reading them. So again, kind of the Gish Gallop. So she posted this one article that was titled, Armstrong Admits to Hoax. She thought this was evidence against the moon landing. I took a look at the article, and I came back and said, lady, I see that you didn't bother to read the article whose link you posted, because if you did, you would have noticed that it's an article about Lance Armstrong, not Neil Armstrong. Too funny. I don't know if that counts as a satanic dote, but anyway, that was a story I thought was too funny not to share. Let's move on to the next fallacy. Most of the fallacies we've talked about up through now have dealt with bad premises, but there are, of course, times when the reasoning is simply bad. The general term for this is non sequitur. You'll see Latin phrases like this used a lot in formal fallacy names. Non sequitur simply means it does not follow. So somebody presents premises, presents an argument, but their conclusion doesn't follow at all from what they said. So a common example of this is a more specific fallacy called Affirmation of the Consequent. And that's basically a fancy way of saying, well, if A is true, then B is true. Therefore, it follows that if B is true, then A is true. And this is a fallacy because the logic doesn't necessarily follow like that. If-then statements like this are very popular in logic. And I know I didn't really have the time to cover too much about if and then and statements like that in part 1. But if you're to learn anything about the topic of if-then statements, then know this. If A, then B does not necessarily imply if B, then A. So, for example, if an organism is a fish, then it lives in the water. Let's accept that as true. Does it follow from that if something lives in the water, then it's a fish? No, not necessarily. Dolphin lives in the water, but it's not a fish. Dolphins are mammals. Seaweed and sponges live in the ocean too, but they aren't fish. And remember the circles I talked about in part 1. It's true that if a small circle is drawn entirely inside a big circle, and something is in that small circle, then it's in the big circle too, but something can be within the big circle and still sit outside of the small circle inside. That space in between the two borders. To cite yet another creationist example, because they're just so easy to use, creationists may say, well, if the universe had a divine creator, then we would expect to see order in the universe. Well, we see order, therefore the universe had a creator. Again, does not automatically follow. Or you may see Christians who say, hey, they found Noah's Ark. This proves the story is true. It's a hoax that shows up every so many years, people claiming they found Noah's Ark. So, if you look into this, the reasoning is basically, if the story of Noah's Ark is true, then we might find a boat somewhere. We found the boat, therefore the story is true. Well, The Amazing Spider-Man takes place in New York City, and New York City is real, but it does not follow that the Spider-Man story is true. An even simpler example, though, of a non sequitur is a red herring. The red herring fallacy is when the person who is arguing simply tries to present something irrelevant in order to distract you. And this term was coined in the early 1800s by William Cobbett, who told a story of using a really strong-smelling fish to distract a bunch of dogs from chasing a rabbit. So likewise, a red herring fallacy is when something is presented to distract from the actual argument at hand. Let's say you run into one of these QAnon idiots who claims that the Clintons and the Bush family or whoever are Satanists, and as Satanists, they go to the Bohemian Grove to go worship Satan, and they're involved in a child trafficking ring in order to get children to molest and sacrifice for Satan. And you say, no, that's not what Satanism is about at all. These people you're talking about are not Satanists, even if we assume that they did what you're describing. Satanism instead is this, it's this, it's this, we're against that and that and that, and so on. So you say this, and then suppose in response, the QAnon guy says, well, you say that, but what about the corruption of the Clinton Foundation? And we're seeing Bill Gates buy up farmland, and we know that he spread misinformation about the coronavirus. Are you really going to sit there and be complacent when we know there is government corruption and we have logs of these politicians flying back and forth from Epstein Island? So at this point, your correct response to that should be, what the hell does any of that have to do with the original claim of them being Satanists? See, that is a red herring. Also related to the red herring, or also sometimes related to another fallacy called the tu quoque, which is one I'll talk about later, is the whataboutism. And this is a term that I've only seen in recent years, but it's typically the same thing. People do this all the time. You might say, hey, here's an example of somebody doing a crime in the name of Christianity, and somebody else will say, well, what about the good things that the Christian church has done? What about these orphanages or this charity? Or what about? Yeah, what about it? It's a red herring. If we can point to and talk about an event where somebody did a crime in the name of Jesus, then saying it happened, well, that's a true statement. And the truth of that statement is not changed by any amount of whining, but Christians have done good things too. Or for that matter, what about all the bad things done in the name of Islam? Why do you pick on only Christianity? You know, again, this is the whataboutism. And one final fallacy I would like to group together with these last few I mentioned, these non sequiturs of sorts, is the slippery slope fallacy. I think this is an important one to mention because I saw many references to it in 2022. Most especially from conservatives who would say things like, you can't call the slippery slope a fallacy anymore because all these things we predicted and we were warning everybody about have come true. I said back in 2008 that if we legalize gay marriage, there would be children getting sex changes in the future, and it's happening. Here we are. And this conspiracy theory turned out to be true, and this other conspiracy turned out to be true. All right, let's back up here and break this down. First, what is the slippery slope fallacy, and why is it a fallacy? Well, the slippery slope fallacy goes something like this. If event A happens, then that will lead to event B, and if event B happens, then event C happens as a result, and if C happens, then D happens, and if D happens, then we get to E, and we don't want event E, therefore we should prevent event A from happening in the first place. Now, if all of those steps along the way were true, then yes, it would logically follow. Okay, A eventually leads to E. We don't want E, therefore we don't want A. So where's the fallacy? Well, the fallacy happens mainly when we assume that the entire chain of events we listed is certain, and often it's not. In fact, mathematically, the more you try to further and further assume exact possibilities happening, the less likely your prediction is true. To give a slippery slope example, let's say a father says, well, Bobby, you have to study for this math test, because if you don't, then you'll fail the test. And if you fail too many of these tests, you won't pass. And if you don't pass classes, then you won't graduate. And if you don't graduate, you won't get a good job. And if you don't get a good job, you'll turn to a life of crime, and that will land you in jail. So, Bobby, you've got to study for the math test to avoid jail. So needless to say, that's riding on a lot of hypotheses. That's, riding on a lot of what-ifs. And, for example, maybe Bobby fails algebra, but he goes to summer school where he retakes algebra and passes. Or he passes, but he doesn't graduate, but ends up having a successful career that doesn't need college anyway, or higher education. Or maybe he graduates from college and he does everything else right, but he gets arrested for something else that's completely unrelated, and he goes to jail anyway, despite the math test he studied for back in 8th grade. So, again, the whole argument rests on this string of contingent events whose certainty isn't all that well established at each step. That's what the slippery slope fallacy essentially is. Now, having said that, this doesn't mean that any and all forms of prediction are slippery slope fallacies, and it doesn't mean that slippery slopes don't exist in that sense. Sometimes we can certainly make a reasonable prediction that, well, if I do X, then it will lead to result Y, and I don't want that, therefore it's in my best interest to not do X. There's nothing fallacious about thinking, well, I'd like to get out of my car and strangle this person honking his horn at me in traffic, but I realize if I did that, I would be taking a risk of going to jail, maybe the person harming or killing me in self-defense. So I'm going to exercise some self-preservation through self-restraint and just stay here in my car. That's not a slippery slope fallacy. That's just good foresight. But again, when you're trying to establish a connection from A to B, B to C, C to D, and so on, all the way to Z, no steps of which have actually happened yet, and you're still kind of riding on speculation, each step along the way is iffy, then yeah, you may in fact be using the slippery slope fallacy. I'll sometimes see the Jesus freaks, though, saying, aha, but my prediction about gay marriage leading to the sexualization of children in schools came true. So you can't call it a conspiracy theory, you can't call it a fallacy. Well, two things. First of all, a lot of the people I see making these sorts of predictions have made plenty of wrong ones, too. There are the same sorts of Christians who are saying, these are the same sorts of Christians who are saying rock and roll music would lead to the full collapse of society and so on. I mean, just pick up any Jack Chick track or, other evangelical track from 20 or 30 or more years ago, and you see these sorts of things. Or for that matter, go to your favorite search engine and look up a list of failed end-of-the-world predictions by year over the centuries. So my point here is, if you've made 80 different predictions and one of them was vague enough to come true, don't pat yourself on the back too hard. And a second point I want to make here, though, is that, remember I said in part 1 that it's possible you can use bad premises or bad reasoning and happen to stumble across a true prediction, a true conclusion, rather. And it doesn't mean the original thinking was justified. You can still have bad logic and stumble across a true conclusion. Logically, I explained how that can happen. Now, a sort of slippery slope I sometimes see against Satanism is, well, if everybody thought it was a good idea to do these satanic things like pride and lust and atheism and greed, then this consequence would happen, and that would lead to this other consequence and so on, and society would just become this hedonistic hellhole, and society would collapse, and this and that. To which I say, we are not trying to convert anybody to Satanism. I don't want everybody to be a Satanist. I don't think just anybody can be a Satanist. We're one of the only religions that says quite explicitly that we are not for everyone. So, fear that other people might become irresponsible hedonists is not a valid argument against me, against myself being a Satanist. All right, I've given you a lot of information here on different fallacies, a lot of fallacies talked about, with even more to come. Let us take a break right now. You are listening to Satansplain.
You are listening to Satansplain, real satanic talk with Church of Satan Magister Bill M. For questions, comments, and correspondence, send an email to bill@satansplain.com.
I don't even understand the connection with die for your sins. He died for your sins. Well, how does one affect the other? I hit myself in the foot with a shovel for your mortgage. I don't understand the... And if there is a correlation, why would you do that? Why would you die for someone's sins? Your sins are the only interesting thing about you, dreary, bleak motherfuckers. Your sins are what make you fantastic. That's what keeps us great and exciting and fun. That's what makes you alive, man. You should wear your sins on your sleeve. You should be trying to top your sins on a daily basis. When you go to work in the morning, the first thing out of your mouth tomorrow morning at work should be the dirtiest shit you did tonight, because that's what people want to hear. It makes you, right? Hypothetically, you tell me a story about what a good Christian kid you are and how that good book has filled you with some effervescent, loving light of Jesus that shines out of every pore in your squash. You keep the story going real loud. At the same time, you tell me a story about that one time you kick-fucked a girl with cerebral palsy, and we'll see who draws a crowd. Even your make-believe slapstick Jesus on a stick would have to walk away from you right now. Oh, that's very nice. I pray for you too, but I really want to hear this. Start over. You did what? Was she into it? Oh my God. I can't believe I died for these stories. These stories are fascinating.
If you like religion-bashing laughter and other comedy that's not made for the masses, then check out The Devil's Mischief. Visit devilsmischief.com for more details. The Devil's Mischief, carnal comedy clips and Netherworld novelty numbers available on Radio Free Satan.
Magister Bill M. here with Satansplain. Visit the official website of the show, satansplain.com. You can hear all of the episodes there. You can also listen to Satansplain on Spotify, Audible, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, Apple Podcasts, and other places. Go to Satansplain.com for those links. Satansplain is also on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Please give the show a like and a subscribe, or both, depending on how the platform works. Also, you can email me with questions, comments, satanic anecdotes, what have you. Bill@Satansplain.com is the email address. Continuing with our exploration of logical fallacies, when I talked about the slippery slope fallacy, I mentioned the concept of probability, and there are a number of fallacies based on the misuse and abuse of probability and statistics. I could probably do a whole episode just about the basic mathematics of statistics and how companies and politicians and other people misuse statistics to deliberately mislead people. Back in 1910, a fellow named Andrew Lang had a now famous quotation. He said, "Politicians use statistics in the same way that a drunk uses a lamppost, for support rather than illumination." This isn't to say statistics is useless. If used properly, it is a branch of mathematics that is very valuable. It's supposed to be for illumination. Statistical analysis is still used all the time, for example, in the insurance industry to evaluate risk and find the best premiums to charge and all that. But again, plenty of ways you can misuse statistics and other math to mislead, but let's look at a few popular fallacies in that department. One of these is called the appeal to popularity, saying that an argument or thing must be true because it's popular. Now, obviously, this is a fallacy. Whether or not a premise is true or false has nothing to do with how many people believe it. This is also sometimes called by its Latin name, argumentum ad populum, or sometimes it's also called the bandwagon fallacy. You may hear, well, Christianity says that Satan is real, and Christianity is the most popular religion on the planet. Or you may hear a Christian say, well, millions and millions of people have believed in the Bible and the divinity of Jesus over the centuries. Many have even been willing to die for their faith. I mean, it would be crazy to think that all of those millions of people did it despite being wrong. Okay, but that means nothing in this case. There are millions of children who believe in Santa Claus, but that doesn't make him real. And for you listeners out there who want to write to me or post in the comments, what do you mean, Bill? Santa Claus isn't real. Of course he's real. LOL. Yeah, haha, very funny. Spare me that predictable joke. But for that matter, I'm sure you can find children who would put themselves in danger under a false belief that Santa Claus will give them presents. Maybe a child decides he's going to walk to the North Pole. Keep walking north until you reach Santa Claus. So, it may be a popular belief and a strong belief, but that doesn't make it true. In fact, we could just as well use the popularity argument against Christianity. About 2/3 of the people on the planet are not Christian. So, the popularity argument doesn't really help their case. In fact, if you want some really direct evidence that something is correct or better just because it's popular, all I have to say is look at the Billboard Top 40 on any given week. You think that music is the best that the world has to offer? I rest my case. Another fallacy that falls into this similar category of fallacies with statistics and probability is the Texas sharpshooter fallacy. So imagine this: a cowboy has a gun and he makes 20 or 30 shots against the side of a barn. Then he walks up to a space on the wall where there are a dozen bullet holes that, are sort of close to each other. And he then paints a target around this area so that those 12 shots fall into the bullseye area. So it looks like he shot at it several times. Then he says, wow, aren't I amazing? I got the bullseye 12 times. So likewise, the Texas sharpshooter fallacy is when you have a bunch of data and you cherry pick the data, you only pick the examples that support the ideas you want and you ignore the rest. So we saw some of this, for example, during the Satanic Panic when Christians were taking selective cases of teen suicides and saying, oh, look, all of these teenagers listen to heavy metal, or, oh, look, all of these teenagers played Dungeons and Dragons. There must be a connection here. There are just too many numbers for it to be a coincidence. Well, one factor they conveniently left out is that in the 1980s, there were millions of heavy metal albums sold, millions of D&D units sold, and not millions of teenagers committing suicide. Frankly, suicide is disproportionately common in teenagers anyway for a variety of psychological reasons. And this is where we get into the concept of correlation versus causation. You may have heard of that before, but just because two traits tend to show up together doesn't necessarily mean they're related. One event preceding another doesn't always mean the first event caused the second. But going back to that Dungeons and Dragons example, as I understand it, somebody did a more scientific look at the numbers and collecting the data, comparing these cases of teen suicide among D&D players compared to teen suicide among non-players, and found that, if anything, you could use the statistics to argue just the opposite, that teens who played D&D were statistically, on average, far less likely to commit suicide than those who didn't. So, go figure. An even simpler form of this fallacy, I would say, is what's known as the anecdotal fallacy. The anecdotal fallacy, that's when instead of presenting an argument, you just present a personal anecdote. Now, it's fine to use an anecdote as a means to get to a bigger point or illustrate a bigger point. And of course, here on Satansplain, I play the Satanecdote segment from time to time. But that's not a fallacy. I'm not even making a point with the Satanecdotes. I'm just sharing stories from fellow Satanists for our own entertainment. You might also offer an anecdote as a counterexample to something somebody's saying. That might be valid. But in yet another example from the Satanic Panic days, you would see daytime talk shows who would spend 10 or 20 minutes on an anecdote from like one guest or two guests, claiming they were abducted by quote-unquote Satanists, they were forced to have sex, chop up a live animal, and so on. And it's from these one or two anecdotes we're supposed to jump to the conclusion that Satanism is this terrible thing, where roving bands of devil worshippers are in every major city causing vandalism and kidnapping and murder and all that. But never throughout the show does the host or the audience cast some skepticism and say, well, were these isolated cases? Do we even have any evidence to corroborate the story that you just told, and so on? In fact, one of the dumbest anecdotes I've heard against Satanism in recent years is the Anton LaVey deathbed recant story. So the claim is basically that Anton LaVey, founder of the Church of Satan, author of the Satanic Bible, who died in 1997, had supposedly recanted on his deathbed. So before he died, he supposedly renounced Satanism and said something that, he turned to Jesus or something like that. And of course, from this anecdote, we're supposed to take this as a big discredit to Satanism itself. Okay, first and foremost, the validity of Satanism is not dependent upon the details of Anton LaVey's biography. Keep this in mind every time you hear one of these idiotic claims on the internet about, oh, Anton LaVey recanted on his deathbed, or, oh, Anton LaVey beat his wife, or, oh, Anton LaVey secretly believed in a literal Satan, or, oh, Anton LaVey didn't really have a job at any time in police photography. He died before I was born, but I read that on the internet, so, it must be true. So, first of all, you'll find that most of these accusations came out right after he died in 97 and seem to be just based on somebody else's say-so, namely somebody who has an axe to grind with the Church of Satan. I know Michael Aquino was spreading these stories as much as he possibly could on alt-Satanism and places like that back in the day. But secondly, and even more importantly, we Satanists are Satanists because we've read what Satanism is through books like the Satanic Bible, and we identify with it. So my agreement with what's written in the Satanic Bible has nothing to do with the personal biography of the author. But getting back to this deathbed recant story, this is a stupid thing I've seen Christians do with other people. There is a myth that goes around to this day that Charles Darwin recanted evolution on his deathbed. There's no evidence for that. He died in the presence of his family, including his sister, and his sister said, Charles Darwin said nothing of the sort. But even if we assume Charles Darwin did claim on his deathbed that evolution was a lie and, that God created humans and whatnot, does that make all of the scientific evidence for evolution disappear? Are the transitional fossils and the DNA evidence, are they all magically gone now? No, of course not. It's like claiming, Einstein said E equals MC squared wasn't true just minutes before he died. It's silly. The reason E equals MC squared is true is not because Einstein said it was. It's true because we can verify it. We can scientifically do it. We can see the work he did to arrive at that equation. And likewise, even if we went along with this silly claim that LaVey recanted on his deathbed, it would not make the pages of the Satanic Bible disappear. Furthermore, this claim, the Anton LaVey deathbed recant story, came from a YouTube clip somebody made, I think, at least 10 years after LaVey had already died. So right away, that's already enough of a reason to be skeptical of the claim. Never mind the fact that anybody can claim a deathbed recant story about just about anybody. Remember what I said in part 1 about the burden of proof. The burden of proof is still on the person making the claim. Now, on top of all that, LaVey died from pulmonary edema, which would mean that he couldn't even physically speak just before he died, even if he wanted to, fluid in the lungs. So, yeah, the stupidest of stupid anecdotes. Now, let's get to another group of related fallacies, another set of fallacies I would group together as being all appeals of some sort, appeal to popularity, appeal to authority, appeal to emotion, and some others. Let's break each one of these down. I've already talked about the appeal to popularity, so I won't repeat that. But there are also appeals to other things. Take, for example, the claim that some idea or a claim must be valid because it's very old. That's the appeal to antiquity. The fallacy of argumentum ad antiquitatem, which is the fancy Latin way of saying appeal to oldness. The idea that some claim must be true because it's really old. For example, well, Bill, the Bible is the oldest existing book in all of human history, and that says something. It wouldn't have stayed this long if it were not true. Obviously, though, something being old doesn't automatically make it better or more likely to be true. Either an argument is valid on its own or it isn't. Also, on a side note, the Bible is not the oldest book, as some people claim. We can find older existing books, Euclid's Elements, for example, which coincidentally enough is a mathematics book that applies deductive logic in thousands of ways. That's older than the Bible. But in fact, some people use the exact opposite fallacy and appeal to newness. Argumentum ad novitatum, the appeal to newness. Every year I see some idiot making a quote-unquote new satanic organization or a new branch of Satanism or an evolved form of Satanism. Because, the big, bad, fascist, gatekeeping Church of Satan is too old and antiquated and clunky and doesn't address problems of today. And of course, these organizations don't actually present anything new. They don't present any ideas that Satanists in the Church of Satan can't believe or do anyway if they want to, or they'll try throwing out part of Satanism without realizing it's connected to everything else, or they'll throw in something that isn't compatible with Satanism at all. It's just some narcissist calling himself the high priest of whatever. So yeah, appeal to newness fallacy. Another appeal type of fallacy we see all the time is the appeal to emotion. This is when somebody simply tries to manipulate an emotional response in place of a valid or compelling argument. Now, influencing somebody through emotion can be a powerful manipulative tool. See the book, The Satanic Witch. There is a time and place for emotion and emotional release. For that matter, see The Satanic Rituals. Having said that, when we are talking about logic, it should go without saying that adding a lot of emotional appeal to an argument still begs the question of whether those premises or that conclusion is factually true. As commentator Ben Shapiro is famous for saying, facts don't care about your feelings. And whether you agree with Ben Shapiro or not politically on things, he's right about that. Because we see this all the time from people all across the political spectrum. With abortion, for example, you'll hear some people on the pro-life side saying, well, if you're not pro-life, then you're a gleeful baby killer. And you have equally annoying people on the pro-choice side saying, well, if you're not pro-choice, then you're a misogynist who wants to take away women's reproductive rights. Again, neither of these is a logical argument. They're both appeals to emotion. I'm sure there are some people who will argue that every argument is ultimately an appeal to emotion because in the end we want the satisfaction of hearing a sound argument. But there's still a big difference between using empirical facts and making a logical argument for something and throwing all of that away just to make an emotional appeal. Bill, how could you be a Satanist instead of a Christian? When Jesus died for you, he died for your sins. He had nails in his hands and a crown of thorns on his head for you. Okay, that's not an argument for why I should consider the dogma or philosophy of Christianity as true. That's just a guilt trip. Let's move on. Yet another appeal fallacy that people use all the time is the appeal to authority. So the argument here is that something must be true because somebody really important said it. So when it comes to Satanism, you will see people who say, well, we brought on this occult expert to go talk about the dangers of Satanism and what Satanists do. And, the viewing audience will be like, ooh, an occult expert. He must really know his stuff. Now, none of this is to say that we should dismiss expertise in all situations. If you're planning a wedding, for example, you probably want to go to a professional bakery to get the cake. You want to hire a professional photographer to do the wedding photos. I suppose it's entirely possible you can get your grandmother to bake a cake and somebody who's not a professional photographer might be able to take photos with a smartphone. And conversely, there's a chance you hire a professional photographer, but he or she is just terrible at taking photos or shows up drunk or something. But more often than not, a professional can do a professional job, and that's what you're hiring a professional for. A physicist with a PhD in astronomy typically knows more about the solar system than some Bible thumper who just reads from the book of Genesis. Of course, when a physicist publishes a research paper, you can't just say it's true simply because an important person published it. No, you have to actually look at the science, look at the argument, see if it holds up, and so on. Likewise, I am a magister of the Church of Satan. You could say I'm an expert or authority on Satanism in some regard, but Satanists don't listen to this show and say, well, a magister said this thing on this episode, so it must be true. No, you shouldn't be taking my word on things. If you're ever doubtful on what I say in any given episode, by all means, go research it yourself and see if I'm wrong. Feel free to debate me on things if you think I'm wrong. Bill@Satansplain.com is the email address. Speaking of appeal to authority, there are common fallacies which are based on the idea of who is saying something or the person involved. The most popular of these is the ad hominem, which basically means at the person. The ad hominem is when you attack the speaker's character or traits rather than the argument itself. So, for example, you'll see a politician who says, I think the current budget and strategy we have in place for this particular economic problem is bad, and here's a different plan that I propose. And then somebody will say, well, the people should know that this politician is married but was caught downtown with a prostitute, and here he is in 2014 photographed at a party with this guy who's a friend of David Duke, who's a racist and a former Klansman, so we can't believe anything he has to say about his economic policy. Okay. That's not an argument. We could call it a red herring, but another type of fallacy, as I said, is the ad hominem, because we're attacking who the person is and not what the argument is. So the question should be whether or not the economic plan he's proposing has any merit, and we have to look at the plan itself to see. But you'd see the ad hominem fallacy happening all the time. With Satanism, well, there's an obvious example. You'll be debating with somebody and they may try saying, well, you are a Satanist, so I can't believe anything you may be saying because Satan is the prince of lies, and, ignore whatever it is that I'm saying, a link I'm posting, whatever. So again, this is an obvious logical fallacy. An argument either stands on its own logically or it doesn't. Whether or not you like the person who is saying the argument should be irrelevant. There is a popular spin-off of the ad hominem, which is called the Reducto ad Hitlerium, or in other words, reducing things to Hitler. I talked about this a few episodes back. It's what I call the 6 degrees of Hitler game. This is when somebody completely ignores whatever argument they hear somebody giving, completely throws logic out the window, and instead tries to connect the argument or opponent to Hitler or Nazis in some way, and then thinking that if they can do this, this somehow makes them the winner of the argument. There's a similar phenomenon called Godwin's Law, named after attorney Mike Godwin, which says that the longer you have an online discussion, the more and more probable it gets that people will make a comparison to Hitler or the Nazis. It doesn't matter whether the discussion is even political, but even when it is political, we'll see people from all different political extremes using this really stupid tactic. I'll see, for example, somebody online make an argument for gun control, and somebody will say, well, you know who else liked gun control? Adolf Hitler. That is not a valid argument, and I say this as somebody who is a fierce supporter of the Second Amendment. I can give you lots of reasons why I am personally in favor of gun ownership, but comparisons to Hitler is not among my reasons, because that's not a valid argument. Before I move on, though, there is something important I want to point out. Not all insults that show up in a debate are automatically ad hominem fallacies. If you are in the heat of debate and throw an insult at somebody, that doesn't necessarily invalidate everything else that you've said. I've seen people try to use that as an excuse to get out of an argument, though. So I'll be in a debate with somebody, the person's losing the debate, and I'll say, no, you fucking idiot, that's not true at all. Here's the reason why. I already told you 10 times, and so here's 3 different articles that refute your argument, and then in response I'll get, Bill called me an idiot. That's name-calling. That's an ad hominem fallacy. No, it's not. Now, if I had said you're wrong because you're an idiot or because you look funny and I left it at that, then yeah, that would have been fallacious reasoning on my part. But when I toss an insult your way, especially if you've seemingly earned it, and I have other stuff to back up what I'm saying, well, no, that the fact I tossed in an insult does not give you a get out of debate free card where you can ignore the rest of what I said. But one more variation I want to give on the ad hominem, well, it's sort of a variation, I suppose. It's a fallacy called tu quoque, T-U, second word, Q-U-O-Q-U-E. So this is known as the you too fallacy, you also fallacy. It's when you claim an argument is invalid or a statement is false because the person saying it has done the same thing. So, for example, suppose film director Michael Moore points at actor Steven Seagal and says, Steven Seagal is fat. But people then look at Michael Moore and say, what the hell are you talking about? You're fat, Michael Moore, you stupid hypocrite. And that counter-argument is actually a fallacy. So let me explain why. What is the premise? What is the claim? The claim is that Steven Seagal is fat. And the reality is, at least at the time of this recording, the last time I checked, he is. Actor Steven Seagal is quite overweight. Now, it's true that Michael Moore is overweight as well. He is quite fat. But the fact that Michael Moore said Steven Seagal is fat does not change the truth of the statement, Steven Seagal is fat. The statement, quote, Steven Seagal is fat, unquote, is still true regardless of who said it. Now, is a fat person a hypocrite for denouncing another fat person as fat? Yeah, but being a hypocrite is different from being a liar. If you're debating somebody, then sure, pointing out hypocrisy on your opponent's side is a common debate tactic and may be valid, but be mindful of the tu quoque fallacy. People will try using a tu quoque fallacy to get out of arguments too. For example, one time I was pointing out that the antics of the Satanic Temple don't really effectively do anything to fight against theocracy. They just backfire and make things worse. And one of their fanboys said, well, I don't see the Church of Satan fixing the problem either. Well, again, doesn't matter. If the antics of the Satanic Temple suck, then they suck. And if you don't like the fact that the Church of Satan doesn't play by the same stupid activism game, well, tough shit. It doesn't lend any credibility to the idea that the Satanic Temple's antics make any sense. There are only a few more examples of logical fallacies I'd like to talk about. One of these is circular logic, so you're probably already familiar with this. This is when you more or less include as one of your premises the point you're trying to prove. So your conclusion is one of your premises when you try breaking things down. Remember I said in part 1 that we're trying to infer something new from the premises. So a classic example is the Christian who says, well, of course God is real. Here are some Bible quotes, and we know the Bible can be trusted because it's the Word of God. Well, okay, that's circular logic. Now, they may not say it that simply, but, I've seen variations on the same thing. Or even worse, I'll see Christians who quote that line from the Psalms that says, the fool in his heart says there is no God, to which I say, I don't believe in the authority of your Bible in the first place. If I did, I wouldn't be an atheist. The fact that the Bible, a book based entirely around monotheism, doesn't think too highly of atheism is not all that surprising. More importantly, not all that convincing. Now, a similar fallacy to circular logic is called begging the question. That's when the premises are as questionable as the conclusion reached. So Pascal's wager, I think, is the most famous example of this. You should look that one up if you're not familiar with it, but a lot of arguments for the existence of God I hear are just forms of begging the question, forms of the begging the question fallacy. The only difference being how much in mental gymnastics are involved. So you've heard arguments like, well, everything comes from something, just like how a painting needs a painter. So there had to have been a creator of the universe, and we call that God. Now, there's several things wrong with this argument. The most obvious question, the question it begs, is, where did God come from? So the answer we usually hear back is, well, God always existed, or God doesn't need an explanation. To which, of course, we can ask, so why can't we just say the universe always existed and skip bringing in this notion of God into the picture altogether, since it doesn't answer anything? They may say, well, the universe is too complex to not have been created. Okay, but then wouldn't a deity who created the universe be even more complicated, and by the same logic, need a creator? Oh, no, he's the exception to the rule. Okay, well, Now you're moving the goalposts, which is another fallacy I talked about, or doing a fallacy that may also be called special pleading, where you set up rules and then make exceptions to them. Well, to most of you, this is probably Atheism 101 stuff you're all too familiar with, but you'll notice a lot of the arguments people use for God come down to things like this. If not personal anecdotes, then these arguments by design, as they're called, or the God of the gaps argument, where you can't explain something or you don't want to explain something and then credit its existence to a deity. Oh, I don't understand this really complicated thing in the universe, therefore God did it. That's basically the God of the gaps, argument there. And really, the logic of arguments by design like that collapses down to, I can't explain it, therefore I can explain it. So that's the root of the contradiction there. One more fallacy, or rather pair of fallacies I will mention, are the fallacy of division and the fallacy of composition. So the fallacy of division is the fallacy of saying that one part of something has a particular trait, therefore the rest of the thing has to share that trait. For example, you are studying at a college where rich families are known to send their kids, therefore you must be rich. Or oil causes rubber to rot, therefore if I drive my car over an oil slick in the road, my tires, which are made of rubber, will suddenly rot away. So that's a fallacy of division. Fallacy of composition is the opposite, the notion that a property shared by one or more individual items are also shared by the rest of the set. This skyscraper is made up of parts that were transported here by trucks, therefore we can carry the whole skyscraper in a truck. An example of this I see leveled against Satanism is one of the many bogus claims we see in the Satanic Temple's quick reference guide, trying to compare the Satanic Temple with the Church of Satan. Now, I did an entire Satansplain episode already debunking this whole thing, but one particular example there was the botched, contextless quote from Anton LaVey saying something about Ayn Rand and concluding that this explains the Church of Satan's political position. So, to break down the argument and show you where the fallacy is, the argument goes something like this. Satanism and Ayn Rand's philosophy of objectivism have a couple of things in common, and Anton LaVey allegedly said they were similar. He didn't, but that's a whole other story. Therefore, Satanism must also share objectivism's view on politics. And as mentioned, we don't. The Church of Satan leaves politics up to the individual members to decide, which is natural since Satanism is a religion that puts the individual and his or her needs above that of the collective. As I mentioned in the Satansplain episode exploring objectivism, Ayn Rand's philosophy, versus Satanism, my overall summary was that I can't see anything that the two have in common other than maybe a skeptical atheist worldview and the idea of putting the individual over the collective. That's it. So regardless, it doesn't follow that Satanism and objectivism would have the same views on politics or economics or the other components. Or another claim, the Satanic Bible is pure plagiarism. Okay, why do you say that? I don't know, I just read it on the internet somewhere. Well, here it is. It was all plagiarized from Ragnar Redbeard's Might is Right. Okay. First of all, Ragnar Redbeard's book is in the public domain, and LaVey credits its source. He was always open about it coming from Redbeard. Redbeard is mentioned on the Satanic Bible's dedication page, and LaVey even ended up writing the introduction to a long overdue reprinting of Might is Right. Second of all, and more importantly here, when we're talking about the fallacy of division, the parts copied and altered from Might is Right make up less than 6 pages of the book. That's about 2.2% of the entire book's pages. Yes, I did the math. So, even if we go along with the claim that LaVey plagiarized that part, and he didn't, it doesn't mean that the entire book was plagiarized. Yet, I have seen more than a few idiots claiming this on social media these days. Go figure. Usually the same idiots who try to claim that Satanism was all taken entirely from Ayn Rand, with ritual thrown in. Again, I've done entire episodes explaining how we know this is not the case. So I've spent part 2 of this 2-part special giving you many, many different examples of logical fallacies. As I said, there are still many more out there. If you search online for lists of logical fallacies, you can find more. yourlogicalfallacyis.com is, again, one website I would recommend for quick overviews of popular fallacies. A listener wrote to me and asked me if I was planning on doing an episode with tips on how to debate in general. I think that might warrant its own episode. It's not something I'm going to try to cram into the end here. I will give a reminder that I gave near the beginning of part 1, and that is, logic is not this eternal property of the universe, nor is it something that governs all human behavior. Not everybody goes about life logically. Even the people who claim to only do things logically or claim to believe things only with empirical evidence don't really do so. That comes down to the cognitive science of belief. Also, some people might not be worth your time debating. You don't have to debate with every person you come into disagreement with. I mean, I probably do that a lot myself, admittedly. I enjoy it, but I realize people don't change their minds overnight. I do, however, firmly believe that if you know even just a little bit of logic, a little bit about logic and fallacies, you can better prepare yourself against faulty arguments. You can better tell when somebody is trying to manipulate you. You can look at a news piece with more skepticism. You can prevent people from having more control over you in that way. Undefiled wisdom, knowing truth from fantasy, being your own god. It's what Satanism is about, isn't it? Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time on Satansplain. Hail Satan. Bye-bye.
You have been listening to Satansplain. For more information about the show, visit the official website at Satansplain.com. And for more information about Satanism itself, visit churchofsatan.com. This episode, copyright 2023, Magister Bill M.